Whither have people fled from God's presence? Where have people fled from God's presence? Psalm 139 verses 7 to 8. The psalmist would confess and say, Lord, where shall I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to the heavens, you are there. And if I make my bed in Sheol, in hell, you are there still. God's presence is everywhere. But still, we try to flee from God's presence. Whenever we flee from God's presence, we shall not have peace in life. When we break the commandments and the laws of God, we cannot expect to lead an orderly life. When we live a depraved life, we cannot expect to have a blissful existence in life. All things flee from him or her who flees from God. In the Old Testament, we have the book of prophet Jonah. Jonah fled from God. Jonah was a Hebrew prophet. God called him and assigned him, and he said to him, go to Nineveh and preach repentance. Nineveh is in Iraq, in Mesopotamia in those days, what we call today as Mosul. So he was asked to go towards the east in Mesopotamia and Nineveh, which was about 1,000 kilometers away from Israel. But Jonah did not go there. He fled from God's presence. Instead of going towards Nineveh, he went towards Tarshish. Tarshish was in what we call today in Sardinia in Italy. It was 2,500 kilometers away from Israel. He was a prophet, but he did not carry on the commandment of God. He fled from God's presence. Instead of going 1,000 kilometers towards Nineveh and preach the gospel or the good news that God had given him, he went 2,500 kilometers away from his assigned place, and he was hiding from God. He fled from God's presence because he did not want the people of Nineveh to get converted. He was a Jew, a Hebrew, and those people were Gentiles. So he did not want the Gentiles to get converted and then get saved in their life. And that's the reason he took the opposite direction in the west. Instead of going towards the east, he went towards the west. All efforts he made to go far, far away from God. He fled from God. But all those who flee from God will always bring disaster, not only upon themselves, but on the others also. And so did Jonah bring disaster upon himself. When he took a boat and then went towards Tarshish, there was a storm, as we all know. And the crew on the boat, they came to know that Nineveh was hiding from God. And the boat was about to sink. And then he confesses that he was running away from God's presence. Then they throw him into the ocean. And then you know the story, he gets swallowed up, and then the whale spits him on the shores of Nineveh. And then he goes and preaches over there. And that is another part of the story. But Jonah fled from God's presence, and he brought disaster not only for himself, but for all others also. All who flee from God, all things flees from him or her. My dear brothers and sisters, in today's gospel reading we heard about the parable of the wedding banquet. The invitees fled from God's banquet. They were given prior notice to come for the banquet of the king's son. And when the time came, they fled from God's presence and they had their own works to do. and therefore disaster came later on. Now, this particular parable refers to the people of Israel. The people of Israel was a chosen race, chosen by God through Abraham and the others, and God protected them, guided them, blessed them with priests, prophets, and commandments. Everything that was good, God gave them. And they were supposed to produce and prepare themselves for the coming of the Messiah. And that is the banquet. When the Messiah came, they treated him very badly. They threw him out of the city and then they crucified him. They do not associate with the Messiah. And the time came, historically speaking, the time came in 70 AD, the Romans came and butchered the Jews. They destroyed their city, and the temple was totally demolished, and it was totally annihilated. More than 1.1 million Jews were killed in 70 AD because they fled from God's presence. They became redundant. They were called to participate in the banquet which Christ had prepared for them by way of salvation, but they fled from Christ, and then the disaster came. God takes his time to bring upon a disaster on people. He gives them a lot of chances. It was almost about 40 years later only, the catastrophe fell on them. And so much so, all the Jews were butchered in Jerusalem. Blood started flowing like a river, literally like a river on the streets of Jerusalem. Because when the invitation came for them, instead of attending to the invitation, they fled from God's presence. And so they were destroyed. My dear brothers and sisters, we need to raise two questions. One is, why have they fled from God's presence? According to the parable, Jesus in the parable says, they made light of it. They made light of the invitation that the king had sent. They do not value the invitation that God had given them. They do not consider worthy the invitation that God had given them, and therefore they made light of it. And because of that, disaster fell upon them. Sometimes we do not give much importance to things that are spiritual in life. We give more importance to things that are temporal and passing, transitory things. But there are things in life that are eternal. We need to give attention to these things, not to make light of these things. So that is the first thing that we need to keep in mind, not to make light of the call that God has given us in our lives, to attend to our duties. By way of Christian duties, we need to perform. That's the way we need to reciprocate God's call. But if we make light of God's call and go on our way, a day will come when wrong things will catch upon us. We should not make light of God's invitation, God's call in life. The second question that we need to raise is, whither have the people fled from God's presence? Where have they fled? According to the parable today, one man went to his farm and another man went to attend to his business. Both were good things. One man went to the farm to sow and to reap. The other man went to his business to buy and to sell. They were engaged upon good works. We need to work, we need to earn. These are good things that we need to do. But we should always keep in mind, there is a time for everything in life. The book of Ecclesiastes chapter 3, very beautiful. It says, there's a time under the sun for everything. There's a time to be born, there's a time to die. There's a time to plant, there's a time to pluck up. There's a time to kill, there's a time to heal. All things have its own time in life. When we mess up with these things, this proportion in life, it is then that wrong things happen to us. What has to be given importance at a particular time must be given importance. These particular invitees, they were doing good things, but they were doing at the wrong time. Doing a business was nice. Going to the farm and producing something is very good, but not at the time when the king wanted them to do something else. Many a time we do these kinds of things. We do the right thing at the wrong time, and therefore disasters follow. Sometimes the good things become bad things in life. When we do it illegitimately, we manage those things. Shakespeare in his sonnet 94, very beautifully, the concluding line very beautifully says, "The sweetest things turn sourest by their deeds. The sweetest things turn sourest by their deeds. Lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds." Lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds. When good things are done at a wrong time, the bad becomes worse in life. So each thing has got its own timing, its own space in our life to do. We need to do those things at the right time. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, what are the consequences when we flee from God's presence? Always when we flee from God's presence, there is misery, there is disappointment, there is lack of peace in our lives. Our hearts are made for Thee, O Lord. They are restless until they rest in You, St. Augustine said. There is a cavity in our hearts for the presence of God. But if you fill this cavity with something else apart from God, the heart will always be yearning for God. There will be restlessness. That's what St. Augustine said. Our hearts are made for Thee, O Lord. They are restless until they rest in You. If we flee from God, all things flee from us. If you do not shelter God in your life, nothing will shelter you in your life. There's a very beautiful poem by Francis Thompson. He wrote that ode, a long poem in the year 1893, The Hound of Heaven. Very beautiful poem. If you go home, please go to the net and read this poem. The Hound of Heaven. God is a hound. God is a hound that is in pursuit of a soul. The soul may run away from God, but God keeps persistently following the soul until He conquers the soul. The soul may go astray in many wrong ways, pursuing wrong things in life, and those things will never satisfy the heart until that heart rests in God. Very beautiful poem. It goes like this. I fled Him down the nights and the days. The poet says, Francis Thompson, I fled Him down the nights and the days. I fled Him down the arches of years. I fled Him down the labyrinthine ways of my own mind. And in the midst of tears, I hid from Him. Herein we have a story of Francis Thompson. He wanted to become a priest, but then later on he took some other profession, and then he went into drugs. He became a beggar and died as a destitute in life. But he was hiding from God. God gave him an occasion, but he didn't follow that one. And that's the reason he says, he tried to find out peace and happiness in the laughter of children, in the nature that God had created, but nothing gave him peace. He was running away from God, but then God followed him. And beautiful words he would say, but with unhurrying chase and unperturbed pace, deliberate speed, majestic instancy, they beat, and the voice beat more instant than the feet. All things betrays thee who betrays me. That's what the voice of God says. All things betrays thee who betrays me. He who shelters not God in his life, nothing will shelter him. Not shelters thee that shelters me not. Any person who flees from God will always experience that all other things will flee from him. If you flee from God, your friendship will flee from you. If you seek solace in things that are temporal, the eternal things will flee from you. He who flees from God, all things will flee from him. That was the message of that beautiful poem, The Hound of God. My dear brothers and sisters, one thing we should always keep in mind, our hearts are made for God. Our hearts are made for God. They are restless, and they shall be restless until they rest in God. Amen.